This is the Analogue Pocket Indigo Anodized Aluminum Limited Edition handheld console. It is perhaps the most indulgent piece of gaming hardware I have ever bought. It is undeniably beautiful, and it also has something of a controversial and eye-watering price tag. However, I bought one. I've spent the last couple of weeks testing it out, and was it all worth it? Keep watching and find out. Okay, so firstly, my apologies that this video review is coming a little bit later than I'd planned. Buying one of these things is a big financial commitment. It is a very expensive console, particularly if you're importing one from outside of the USA. So I felt like I owed it to my viewers to put quite a bit of time into the testing in order to give a proper, balanced, informed review. But in truth, I've been having an absolute ball playing on this thing, and I've just struggled to tear myself away from it and start filming a video. So the video is going to be split up into a few separate bits. First of all, a little bit of information on what this thing actually is. Then we'll talk about what's good about it. Then we'll talk about what's bad with it. And then a few other interesting features that I think you might be interested to know. And then my conclusions on what I actually think about this console and whether it feels like it was actually worth me buying it. So first of all, what is it? So what I've got in my hand here is the latest iteration of the Analogue Pocket gaming handheld. It's a Game Boy-like device that enables you to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games in the cartridge slot, and it emulates the original hardware using a technology called FPGA. Basically, it has a programmable chip inside here which will mimic the chips of the original hardware. Now, since the original release of the black and the white versions of the console in plastic, they've done a number of different limited editions with a range of different colors, a glow-in-the-dark version, and even some clear plastic ones, which are a really nice throwback to the Game Boy Color. However, this edition is the first and perhaps only metal version of the console. Each individual plastic component has been replaced with a precision machined aluminium counterpart, making for what could arguably be the ultimate edition of this already premium console. So in short, it's very fancy and it is very expensive. Many would say too expensive. In this video, I'll be offering my honest opinion on this console, the good and the bad, and I'll let you know how I'm feeling now about having bought one, having spent a couple of weeks now actually playing on it. Now, do bear in mind, a lot of what I'm saying in this video will also probably apply to the plastic versions of the Analogue Pocket, as this is actually my first experience of using an Analogue Pocket handheld. That said, it is clear that the metal parts do make a significant difference in the whole experience of playing on it. So let's start by being positive. What is good about the Analogue Pocket Anodized Aluminum Limited Edition? So first of all, of course, the metal shell. It looks great. It feels really nice to the touch, and it makes the console feel really solid, really sturdy. It kind of reminds me of my MacBook Pro, and that is definitely a compliment. It looks nice in pictures, but in the flesh, it really does look great. Everyone I've shown it to, if they've seen it or handled it, has just been like, ooh. I cannot resist picking it up and playing on it. And once I'm playing on it, it's been very hard to put down. Yes, it is expensive, but at least it feels expensive. It's solid, it's detailed, it's precise. The shape of the D-pad and the buttons both look and feel great on the console. There is minimal labeling, but it's not really needed. The A and B type buttons are convex and the other two are concave, differentiating the two pairs quite effectively. In fact, the only label on any button is on the analog home button at the very bottom. The consistent matching colors and materials on the buttons all around on the console look and feel great. Even down to the tiniest of the buttons, nothing has been kept in plastic. Now, the biggest draw of this and every other version of the Analogue Pocket has got to be that screen. It is incredible. This cannot be understated. I own a lot of different Game Boys with a lot of different types of screens, and even then, this has blown me away. Not just because of the clarity of the display, the color palettes are fantastic, the pixel scaling is absolutely spot on, so the image is both bigger than on the original Game Boy, but also perfect to look at. Not only does it look great with the Game Boy, with the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, but every other piece of hardware that this thing can emulate also looks amazing on the screen. I'd heard a lot of hype about it. People always talk about the screen on this thing, so I was kind of skeptical, but really, it does deliver. And it's not just all about visuals, is it? The sound on this thing is great. It does have a headphone jack. You can plug in your headphones and it sounds great through there. But also, unlike many Game Boy consoles, this has a stereo speaker setup, and a very cleverly designed one, because the screen takes up so much real estate. But on the side, you've got the speaker opening on the left and the right, which not only cleverly positions the speakers, but also kind of projects the sound out to the sides, giving a really wide spatial stereo sound effect. This is great for playing games, and it's also great when you're making music. Now that brings us on to the fact that this emulates the original Game Boy hardware really accurately. It's not just emulating the software, it's actually emulating the console itself and running the original code from the cartridges or the ROM files that are loaded up on there. Not only does it emulate the visuals accurately, but the sound is perfect. And this is important if you are making music. For example, I've spent a lot of time using LSDJ, which relies on the accurate reproduction of the original sound chips. And it sounds great and it behaves just as the original Game Boy. Not only can you play LSDJ, but the Analogue Pocket actually has a version of Nanoloop music production software built into the console itself. I found it really great to use with LSDJ. The display was easy to see, the controls worked just perfectly, and I could spend hours and hours creating music knowing that the sound would come out just right when I was recording afterwards. Of course, the big advantage of this compared to many other modern Game Boy clones on the market is that this can actually play the original cartridges. Not just Game Boy and Game Boy Pocket, but also Game Boy Advance without the need for any adapters. However, if you want to play games from other consoles, such as Sega's Game Gear handheld, you can also buy some optional adapters, which allow you to use those too. Now, when I first got the console, it was on an early firmware and was somewhat restricted. You can update the firmware, and there are regularly updated versions of this available for download. You simply put them on an SD card, plug them into the console, and it does the job of updating and adding more features each time. Now, applying these updates does make a significant difference, not least of which is the fact that you can save state as you are playing. Now, that is whether you are running games from a ROM file or whether you're using the original cartridge. Now, while I was waiting for that SD card to arrive, my first experience of playing on this thing was a full playthrough of my favorite Game Boy Advance game, Metroid Fusion. Now, this is a fantastic game. I've played it time and time again, but there are some quite brutal save points along the course of playing this game, and I really missed being able to save state in the same way that I had when I was playing it more recently on Nintendo Switch, for instance. So when I got my SD card and I managed to update the firmware and found that it then allowed to use the save states, not only that you can do that, but also very easily, was a big relief. It certainly made my next playthrough a little more easy, even if you can call that cheating. So saving a state basically takes a snapshot of where you are up to with your gameplay, and if you mess up whatever you're doing afterwards, for example in a boss battle or something like that, you can easily reload that snapshot and have another go from where you were when you saved it. Now, this allows you to create lots and lots and lots of these save points, and even if you fill up all of those slots, you can easily go back and delete the ones that you don't need. In fact, you can even put the SD card into your computer and back up those saves if you want to keep them. To save state while you're playing, all you need to do is press the analog button at the bottom and up on the D-pad, and it automatically just saves your progress where you are at. The SD card itself is housed in a subtle but very easily accessible spring-loaded slot in the side of the console. So the biggest change that's come with the various firmware updates for this console since its release is the introduction of FPGA cores. These allow the console to mimic a wide range of classic gaming hardware by taking information straight from the SD card. What was a very pleasant surprise to me is just how easy this is to do. There's a wide range of automatic updaters and compilers for installing these cores onto your SD card and then onto your console. I used one called Pupdate by Matt Pannella, primarily because it's Mac compatible in addition to other operating systems that are available. It made what should be a complex process very, very simple. It does everything for you, and it even adds some games. That said, it is easy to add your own ROMs onto the SD card for various different platforms. Some were trickier than others, such as Neo Geo and Game & Watch. However, in every case, a bit of persistence and perseverance pays off, and it is always worth it when you end up getting to play the games. In fact, I was thinking about it, and this is probably the most indulgent bit of gaming hardware I have owned since I had my own Neo Geo arcade machine with a 4-slot board inside it. And it is amazing to think that I can now play the same games I played on that arcade machine on this little handheld. Now, one of the features I have found very useful on the Analogue Pocket is the sleep mode. A simple tap of the button on the side will put it to sleep, and then it will sit without you playing it for hours on end, not necessarily draining the battery too much. And then when you want to pick up and play again, you simply tap that power button again, and it will bring you right back to where you were before. Now, although this doesn't work on all of the different cores, it works on the main ones, and it certainly works well enough to be a very useful feature. It also works with cartridges when you're playing on those. That said, the shutdown and boot up process is relatively quick. If you want to shut down, you just press and hold the power button for 2 seconds and it shuts itself off again very quickly. And then when you want to boot back up, press and hold for 2 seconds, wait for the Analogue logo to show up on screen, and it'll boot itself up. And again, it doesn't take much time to take you to the main menu, allowing you to choose whether you want to load up a ROM or play from a cartridge. It'll allow you to hot swap the cartridges. You simply come out to the main menu, unplug your cartridge, plug a different one in, launch that cartridge. I think it's great. It's a really good, simple, effective, quick interface. In fact, speaking of the interface overall, it is very intuitive, very clean, and there's some nice little Easter eggs in there too. For example, when you go to the memories, which is your save states, it's got a nice little quote from Blade Runner in there. I love these geeky little references. Now, something else I found out after buying the console is that if you are running your games from the FPGA core, which frees up your cartridge slot on the back of the console, you can actually use the DS Rumble Pack, put that into the console, and it will enable the rumble features in games such as Pokemon Pinball for Game Boy Color or Drill Dozer for Game Boy Advance. This was a really nice surprise, and it works really well. Unfortunately, it only works with the original Nintendo DS Rumble Pack. Although the DS Lite version fits in, it is not compatible. I tried loading a game and it went absolutely bananas, just vibrating constantly. So I had to switch it off and take that one out. But with the original Rumble Pack, it works really nicely. It adds a lot to the experience. I was quite pleasantly surprised. Now, in terms of getting your hands on one of those Rumble Packs, good luck. They do appear to be relatively expensive on eBay. I got mine with my original copy of Metroid Prime Pinball, but again, that one seems to have gone up in value as well. So if you are seeking one of these, good luck. I mean, relative to the price of the console itself, it's not a particularly large additional investment, but I would say if you can get your hands on one of these, it definitely adds to the experience. So as well as the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, this runs a range of classic arcade games, home console games, and handheld games, including the original LCD Game & Watch type consoles, really well. It is wonderful to be able to play through all of this classic gaming history on such a good looking and sounding piece of hardware. As for the battery, it is rechargeable via USB-C and it lasts really well. Especially in sleep mode, I can leave it overnight, come back to it the next morning, and there's only a few percent drained. It charges relatively quickly on a suitable USB-C charger. I've been using my phone charger, which is a 45-watt power supply, using the USB-C cable, and it charges it really effectively. It's also worth noting that you can charge it while it's switched off, but you can also play and charge at the same time. So primarily as a standalone console, as a gaming experience in itself, as a means of playing all these different platforms on one machine that can play the cartridges, that can run the ROMs, I am finding it hard to beat. I own a lot of different handheld consoles. Originals, modified, modern interpretations, emulators, original cartridges, different formats, you name it, I've got a whole collection of them. And even in the midst of having all of that to choose from, this really stands out. I love picking it up, feeling that weight, seeing that screen come to life, and settling down to some fantastic looking and sounding games that I know will run perfectly. So there is a lot to get excited about. Now, when I first got this thing, I said it needed to be absolutely perfect in order to be able to deliver on that ridiculous price tag. So does it deliver that perfect gaming experience that I wanted? Unfortunately not. With great expectation must also come great disappointment. So let's take a look at what's not so good about the Analogue Pocket Anodized Aluminum Limited Edition. First and foremost, for me, a big issue is it's not great for Tetris. Now, ever since owning my first Nintendo Game Boy original DMG in 1990, happy 35th anniversary of the release of that console, by the way, Tetris has always been my go-to game when it comes to handheld gaming. I absolutely adore this game. So when I first got my hands on this Analogue Pocket, a big part of my initial testing was spending hours and hours on both the original version of Tetris and the Game Boy Color Tetris DX version. And it was playing on the original Tetris where I first started to notice a couple of issues. The first issue that I had was the A and B buttons would occasionally register as double presses when I pressed them, which means that instead of just rotating 90 degrees, the shapes would flip 180. Which in a particularly heated, intense Game B, level 9, high 5, high score chase, that was a real issue, something of a game breaker. It didn't happen all the time, but on those occasions when it did, it was really frustrating. It's got to be said though, one of the good things about this when it comes to Tetris is that Tetris, the original cartridge, can't save your high scores. But with the option to use save states, you can actually keep track of your high scores and keep a regularly updated high score table. So that is something good. But yeah, those button inputs, I was finding those frustrating. I don't know whether this is a physical hardware issue or an issue with the FPGA cores, but suffice to say, it's frustrating and disappointing. Now that brings me on to the D-pad. It looks good, it feels very comfortable, it is nice to use, but the accuracy or lack thereof really surprised me. The false diagonals, which means that if you're pressing, say for example, to the left, but your thumb slightly shuffles down a little bit, it will register as a downward movement, even without pressing down on the D-pad. Now I've addressed this on some of my cheaper consoles, such as my Powkiddy handheld, where you can add a little bit of Kapton tape to make the inputs a little bit more reliable. However, this was a really expensive console. Not only I shouldn't be having to put up with sort of performance issues like that, secondly, I'm not really keen on taking it apart. I don't want to do any damage to something so valuable. So I'm kind of stuck in the middle. This is something that clearly has been an issue with previous versions of the Analogue Pocket. I've spoken to people who own the plastic version who've done the tape trick and said that that does work. However, this is something Analogue should have been aware of and could easily have addressed. All they needed to do was manufacture a little sticker that goes over the motherboard and encourages the D-pad to behave a little bit more precisely. As I say, I don't really want to take this apart, not only because it's expensive, but also because it's aluminium. And when you've got screws going into aluminium, there are particular issues in terms of the threads. I don't want anything to seize up. I don't want to mess anything up. So at the moment, I'm just going to leave it as it is, and it's not being horrendous when it comes to playing, but depending on the game that you are actually on, sometimes it is quite noticeable. On the subject of the D-pad, it's slightly smaller than the opening. Now that is to allow for effective movement when you're actually pressing on the buttons, but it does sometimes kind of slide about a little bit. And another thing I've noticed is that sometimes when you press particularly hard on a particular diagonal, it will click slightly as it releases. You can kind of feel that in a tactile sense, but also you can hear it while you're playing. I'll just try it on the microphone now, see if you can hear it. So normally when you press the buttons and release, but kind of clicks and releases, it can be quite noisy. That's something that was quite a surprise initially, but to be honest, I've got used to it. It's not really much of an issue now, and it doesn't seem to affect the gameplay at all. But again, this is an expensive console. If there are any issues, I want to let you know about them. Okay, and we've got to address that topic of heat. It has been mentioned elsewhere, but honestly, it's not like, I don't want to be sensationalist here. I don't think it is a particular issue. It's certainly not a worry in terms of the performance of the console. I just think that as the processors get warm, this is made out of aluminium. It will operate as a heat sink to an extent, and the temperature will be conducted through the console. That's not a big issue, and it certainly doesn't get hot, but it does get warm. And with it being made out of metal, and if you are playing for extended periods of time, you kind of get sweaty palms a little bit. You don't really want to be getting your hands all sweaty while you're playing on this thing. So yeah, that is something that is a little bit of a bother, particularly on a hot day. I've found it depends on the general climate in which you're playing. But one of the things about when you first pick up this console and it's got that cool metallic feel to it, it is really nice to handle. But I think a lot of it is that your hands get warm as you play, and that kind of warms up the metal as well. But warm is definitely the operative word. I certainly think it doesn't get hot. It's nowhere near the point where you'd have to think, is this going to cause damage to the console? It's not. It just gets a little bit warm after a few hours of playing, and your hands might get a bit sweaty. It's not a worry, but it's not like I get thrilled about having sweaty palms playing on my games. Now we're back to buttons again. Considering the real precision of the build quality on this console, the shoulder buttons feel a little bit like an afterthought. It's definitely feeling like it's been designed as a Game Boy and Game Boy Color machine, and then it's like, should we try and get it to work with Game Boy Advance as well? The shoulder buttons are positioned on the back, either side of the cartridge slot, and there is a lot of movement on these buttons. There's a lot of lateral movement, side to side, from the back there. There is also quite a lot of travel when you're pressing them down, and there's not really a particularly satisfyingly clicky feedback when they engage. In fact, with these being made out of metal, and with the case being made out of metal, you can actually feel the metallic creak and groan of the springs as you press the button, which isn't really the kind of precise input that you want to be getting. Again, if I put it near the microphone, let's just see if you can hear that. Especially on the release, you can hear that little... It's like a little click and echo. I don't know. I think a sort of a subtle, slight movement with little tactile buttons would be all you need, really. It's not like it's an analog trigger. Yeah, analog console, but it's not an analog trigger. It's just a simple button input. It doesn't need all of that movement, and certainly feels a little bit, I don't know, it just doesn't fit in with the precision of the rest of the console. And I think that with this being a metal console, it's probably a similar thing on the plastic version, but it's a bit noisier when all the parts are made out of metal. Now, also when it comes to actually using these shoulder buttons, the ergonomics aren't great. The ergonomics of the buttons on the face of it are great. It's good for using with Game Boy Color. But if you're playing something like Metroid Fusion, or I've also been playing a lot of Drill Dozer, they make quite a lot of use of those shoulder buttons, and you have to kind of adapt how you're holding the console to get your fingers in the right place. In fact, I found an easier way of holding it when I was playing on Metroid Fusion that had my finger kind of resting against the cartridge. What that did, particularly bearing in mind the aforementioned sweaty hand effect, is that the finger resting on the label of the cartridge actually started to wear away a little bit of the print. In fact, if you're playing on the FPGA cores without a cartridge in the slot, it's actually much more comfortable to hold and use the shoulder buttons. So again, it kind of leans it into encouraging you to emulate instead of using the original hardware, which I'm a bit conflicted about. Now, although I have said I do like the heft of this thing, sometimes it does feel a bit heavy, particularly again if you're having to adapt how you're holding the thing, trying to use those shoulder buttons. It can feel like it's working against you a little bit on occasion. Now, as I say, with games like Metroid Fusion that rely on the shoulder buttons quite a bit, it does feel like a little bit of a compromised gaming experience. But I do think it's redeemed by the amazing visuals and audio you get from this thing. So yeah, just following on in terms of this use of cartridges, for me, the original main appeal of this console was that it should be like the ultimate way to play my collection of Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance cartridges. However, as I say, with Game Boy Advance, I've found it much more comfortable to play the games from ROMs and leave a little bit of clearance for my fingers on the triggers. And as mentioned with the Metroid Fusion cartridge getting in the way, it would have actually been better for me to use the ROM on the FPGA core instead of using the original cart. Also, if you're playing ROMs, you have the option to switch to different cores, which have different advantages. Some might have sleep mode, some might have different display modes, and so on. I don't think you can do that when you're playing from cartridge. I've tried, I've not been able to figure it out. I could be wrong. So if you do know how to do that, let me know in the comments. After beating Metroid Fusion, I got out my Zelda DX cart for Game Boy Color, and I've been having a playthrough on that. I am absolutely loving it. It is a lovely experience. Classic game. Looks great, feels great, controls are pretty good. I'm having a good time playing it. However, it was when I was playing this game that I encountered another issue with this console. You see, in order to be able to enable the use of the lower profile cartridges that you use for Game Boy Advance, the slot for the cartridges is relatively high up in the shell, and there's a lot of the Game Boy cartridge exposed on the back. Now, this is a good thing because you get to see the full label, which looks really nice. You get to see the whole artwork on there. However, when the original Game Boy cartridges or Game Boy Color cartridges are plugged into the slot, there is a tiny little bit of clearance between the cartridge itself and the console, which means that there is a little bit of potential lateral movement. Now, when I was playing this game, I've played it loads of times before, but I am pretty bad at these things of trying to remember what I'm supposed to do when and getting a little bit lost. So every now and then I have to put down my console, go on my phone, look up, figure out what I'm supposed to do, pick the console back up and carry on playing. And on a number of occasions, when I picked the console back up, the gameplay had completely frozen. I had to exit the cartridge through the analog menu and restart it and continue playing. Thank goodness for the save states that I didn't lose any progress. But it happened a few times, and it was only after a little while that I noticed it. As I was putting the console down on my bed, it was placed down, it must have knocked the cartridge, it must have caused a momentary disconnect with the pins, which had caused the game to freeze. And again, if I was playing it from the ROM, that wouldn't have happened. I want this to be a really effective cartridge-based machine, but it's battling against me in terms of trying to convince me to just use it as an emulation machine. So I am a bit conflicted about that. However, I love this game and I am really enjoying the playthrough. I'm just very careful now when I'm putting it down and checking what I need to do next. Now, that said, once I figured out what was happening, I have tried to kind of intentionally crash it by just nudging the cartridge while it's playing, and it's been working fine. So maybe it's to do with how accurately inserted the cartridge is or whatever else. I don't know. But again, it's just something that I need to flag up. If I've encountered crashes, you're going to hear about them. Now, with all of this criticism, it may well sound like I am hating on this console, but I'm not. In fact, I'm really, really enjoying it. But when a company is asking consumers to pay this much for a console, and it's got issues like the ones I've mentioned here, I do think it's inexcusable. I've listed all of the flaws and issues I've noticed so far. I've not missed anything out, and I think it's important to flag these things up. It is a big financial investment for a consumer to get one of these things, and it should deliver a near perfect gaming experience. What's all the more frustrating is the issues that I've encountered aren't particularly huge in terms of a manufacturing point of view, and are definitely things that should have been addressed by this point by Analogue. When they got so much right with this real statement of a console, it's just that bit more frustrating that these little issues exist. So before we get to my final conclusions, here's a few interesting things about this console. As well as using it in handheld mode, you can use an optional dock to connect this up to your TV and allow you to play on the big screen using a Bluetooth controller such as the ones made by 8BitDo, or even a PlayStation 4 or Switch Pro controller. I didn't get the dock. I didn't have any money left after buying this thing, but I think if I was using the dock, I would also be missing out on the kind of experience of actually handling this fantastic metal machine. So for me, I'm quite happy with it in handheld mode, but it's nice to know that the docking option is available. Now, I bought this with the intention of using it as a high-end means to be able to play my original collection of Game Boy cartridges. And when you're using ROMs, there are a range of different cores available. You can play games more comfortably on Game Boy Advance, and you've got less risk of the games themselves crashing. So in many ways, it's better to not actually use it as a means of playing the cartridges. It's a victim of its own success. It performs a little bit too well when it comes to emulation. And in a way, if I end up using it primarily as an emulation machine, is it just another in the line of all of those Anbernic, Powkiddy and Mio Mini type consoles I've already got in my collection? The controls on a lot of those other consoles are arguably better than the ones on here as well, but the reproduction of those original games by mimicking that original hardware is done so well on here that it is different. It is better than the software emulation devices. Now, it's arguable that a lot of people wouldn't really notice that difference, but there is a difference. And as far as these things go, this does its job very, very well. So it'll emulate all those classic games perfectly, and also it'll play my original collection of Game Boy cartridges. I'm looking at it as a best of both worlds kind of situation. I also got a case for it. It's not the official Analogue one, which is like a clear plastic shell to go around it. I didn't really like the look of that, and again, I'd completely run out of money when I was buying this thing. But this one I found on Amazon. It's not the official one, but it is purpose-built for the Analogue Pocket. It protects the console really well, which is crucial if I'm ever going to take this thing out of the house. So in conclusion, what are my thoughts on the Analogue Pocket Anodized Aluminum Limited Edition? So when I first picked up this console, I said that it had to be pretty much flawless in order to justify that huge price tag. Is it flawless? Sadly, no. But was it worth the money? Also, no. There's a good reason these are still available on Analogue's website weeks after its initial release. They misjudged it, they got too greedy, and they priced it too high. That said, I'd be surprised if they reduced the price at this point. In fact, I'd be kind of annoyed if they did reduce the price after I bought one of these things, even though the Indigo version is no longer available for sale. I think what they should do is just sell off the remaining stock at the price they've set and just learn from this in future, and hopefully future releases from this company might be priced a little bit more competitively. However, given the huge range of different handheld consoles I own, there is nothing that I have played that quite matches the physical experience of playing on this console. It looks beautiful, it feels great, and my games look and sound amazing on it. It plays all of my cartridges accumulated over a lifetime of collecting, and it presents them at their very best. It also allows me to accurately emulate a wide range of classic gaming consoles, arcade machines, and handhelds without having to swap to a different console. It combines the thrill of handling and experiencing something truly premium and high-end with the unadulterated joy of playing some of the finest games ever created, looking and sounding their absolute best. It is easy to hate on Analogue as a company. Arrogance and greed are evident in their pricing and their marketing, their limited edition sales tactics, and let's not forget their inflated shipping charges. And in this case, I feel like they misjudged it. They're rightly facing a backlash as a result and getting plenty of ridicule over the asking price of this thing. But when the dust settles, when I finally get my finances back on track, when that buyer's remorse eventually recedes and only the console remains, what I have here is something that I feel is truly special. Perhaps by virtue of just what a ludicrous proposition a console like this is, Analogue have ended up creating something genuinely unique, which delivers a handheld gaming experience like no other. Now, I've got to admit, I started off as an owner of this thing feeling pretty stupid and gullible for having spent so much money on a Game Boy. But in the couple of weeks that I've been testing it, I've actually been feeling really fortunate to be able to experience playing these games on this hardware. So yes, I think I'm going to be keeping it. That said, if I decided to sell it, would anyone be willing to buy it from me? Probably not. Most people have got more sense. Now, I'm feeling a lot more secure now in terms of being a happy owner of this console. I am loving playing on it. But when I first got it, I was going through a whole roller coaster of emotions. In fact, I made a video when I first unboxed it and broke down the costs that just seem to keep escalating and escalating from having bought this thing. And if you want to see a little bit more of that, check it out. I'll link it up here. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Bye.